Next, we have a statement that I'm going to read from Ricci Levy, who could not be with us tonight, but sends her sincerest regards. I'm so very honored in person. My thanks to Alex Andrews for sharing my remarks with you. My name is Ricci Levy, and I'm the president and CEO of the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, founded in 2003. We're a human rights organization whose work is focused at the intersection of sexual and human rights. We are the lead plaintiff in Woodhull Freedom Foundation versus the United States of America, the lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of Sesta Fosta. 10 years ago, we were part of a historic collaborative effort to hold the United States to account for human rights abuses against sex workers. That historic effort led to what's referred to as Recommendation 86, where the United States recognized that violence against sex workers is a human rights violation. Fast forward to today, 10 years later, having this exciting conversation about decriminalizing sex work in the great state of Oregon. As with all human rights work, the work to decriminalize prostitution is integrally connected to the work for social and economic justice, because without those things, there is no sexual freedom, and conversely, without sexual freedom, social or economic justice will not be complete. Our fundamental human right to sexual freedom means that we have a right to bodily autonomy, which means we can decide how we use our bodies, in labor or otherwise. Prostitution involves people choosing to have sex and use their body to make a living. For sexual freedom to be fully recognized as a human right, we have to address the issues of forced labor and trafficking. The criminalization of prostitution is not the answer. The criminalization of prostitution is about controlling our bodies, controlling our access to and participation in labor, in pleasure, in sexual expression. It's about sex. That's the bottom line. Trafficking occurs in all forms of labor, yet we don't criminalize the growing or eating of tomatoes in order to combat trafficking in agriculture any more than we criminalize the cleaning of hotels or homes to combat domestic trafficking. In fact, criminalization makes it more difficult to protect victims by imposing a double burden on them, the burden of prosecution on top of the burden of victimization. Restricting, punishing, criminalizing prostitution is, at heart, another way to restrict sex and pleasure, limiting our fundamental human right to personal autonomy. Criminalization is another example where the war against sex and pleasure have led to laws and policies based on false rhetoric. Decriminalization is the long overdue answer. The Woodhull Freedom Foundation fully supports the right of the individual to consensually exchange sex with another person. I am awed at the courage, the bravery of every one of you who will be sharing your story here with us today. Sex worker rights are human rights, period. So, as she touched on, Sesta and Fosta, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about that. On the 11th of April in 2018, then President Trump signed into law 2 bills which have negatively impacted sex workers: the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, SESTA, and Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, FOSTA. They're anti-trafficking laws. They criminalize online platforms used by sex workers for advertising and information sharing, including for safety purposes. So this legislation impacts the ability of sex workers to use the internet to advertise and provide services, share information, and protect themselves. The End Banking for Human Traffickers Act, passed by the U.S. House of Representatives on the 24th of April that same year, amends the 2000 Victims of Trafficking and Surveillance by Financial Institutions to, quote, detect financial transactions relating to severe forms of trafficking in persons. Due to the conflation of sex work and trafficking, this legislation will impact the ability of sex workers to access financial institutions. Not having access to banking increases the vulnerability of sex workers and decreases their ability to safely navigate the world. FOSTA SESTA makes it a federal crime in the USA to operate an internet service that, quote, promotes or facilitates prostitution across state or national borders. It also makes internet service providers liable for use of federal anti-trafficking and sex work laws in the USA, exposing internet service providers to civil lawsuits and criminal charges if they allow user content that is deemed to promote or facilitate sex work. So do you remember when Craigslist took down its personal section here a couple years ago? That's what that was about. Craigslist was like, we don't want to go to jail for up to 25 years. So we have a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of FOSTA. It's that is with Woodhull and Alex Andrews. It's another one of the plaintiffs. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia ruled that two plaintiffs in the lawsuit by Woodhull Freedom Foundation, Human Rights Watch, Alex Andrews, the Internet Archive, and Ed Kosick to block enforcement of the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, FOSTA, had standing to pursue their constitutional challenge to the statute. The lawsuit argues that the act expansively criminalizes online speech relating to sex work and removes important protections for online intermediaries in violation of their First Amendment rights.